Hello, my name's Peter Bridgewater, and I'd like to take us on a journey in 15 minutes over 55 million years from the geological era known as the Eocene to the one in which we currently sit, which is perhaps called the Anthropocene. I'll touch on that a bit later. And why this period? Well, this period is a very interesting one. It began just after the giant asteroid hit what is now the Gulf of Mexico and wiped out the dinosaurs and many, many other species as well, was the fifth great extinction. And many people, of course, will now say that in the Anthropocene, we're in the sixth great extinction. We'll touch on that too later. But the themes that actually percolate this whole period are changing climates, extinction, biocultural diversity, and something called cultural severance. So how do these things fit together? As I mentioned, this whole era started 55 million years ago or thereabouts after the fifth major extinction event. And after that time, the Earth was actually a lot warmer than it is now. Antarctica was more or less in the same place, but actually had no ice. So there were quite dense forests over what is now Antarctica. But at that period also, the continents had started their major wanderings, and Australia had begun to break away from Antarctica and drift northwards. So between about 55 million years ago to 49 million years ago, there was a relatively small difference between the poles and the equator. And yet, as Australia drifted northwards, the climate began to irrevocably change. And towards the end of that period, we were in what was called an icehouse climate. There was a lot of glaciation everywhere and ice ages. So that icehouse climate pervaded the Earth between about 49 million years ago to about 28, 29 million years ago. And of course, that was when the Antarctic continent, still remaining where it was, began to be covered extensively by the ice that we still have. Well, hopefully we still have for a while yet. During that period, though, as often has happened with all the extinction events that the Earth has gone through, there was enormous and rapid diversification of Earth's biodiversity, the plants, animals, and microbes. In Australia particularly, we had the diversification of mammals, but not following the rest of the world, because in Australia we had already the seeds of marsupials, and we saw an extraordinary diversification of marsupials, whereas in the rest of the continents, of bits of continents drifting around, the mammal evolution was all towards placentals. That is, mammals rather like ourselves. When Australia left Antarctica, it was covered pretty much by quite a lot of rainforest. There were flowing rivers everywhere, the remnants of which we still see in the middle, of course. But as we drifted northwards, Australia became drier and drier, and rainfall became more and more seasonal. So although the arid heart of the climate that we now see was actually lusher than it currently is, it was still drier than the edges. So we already began to see the shape of the Australia we know today. And as I mentioned, the marsupial fauna evolved quite rapidly and very distinctively, and our flora, with Gondwanan remnants, became the flora that we know today, with the dominant woodlands with eucalypts. Incidentally, the first eucalypt fossil is to be found not in Australia, but actually in Argentina. So it shows that that too is a Gondwanan relic. If we now fast forward to about 2.5 million years ago, the Pleistocene era in Australia showed a considerable increase in aridity and an expansion of what is known as the longitudinal dune fields. And if you've ever looked out of a window as you've flown across the continent, particularly from the southeast, going towards Indonesia, Singapore, Europe, and you're lucky enough to have a window seat, you'll see lots and lots of these so-called longitudinal dune fields. But they were all over Australia, including what is known as the Bassian Plain. And the Bassian Plain is the bit of land that was land in those days where the Bass Strait now is. In other words, Tasmania was still connected to the mainland. And Flinders Island, which is, of course, now an island off of Tasmania, was actually part of a mountainous area to the north of that Bassian plain. And so Bass Strait currently, as it stands, overlays all those lakes, rivers, and dunes that were formerly in that Bassian plain area. And of course, it also hides the traces of the first human footprints, which walked from what is now mainland Australia directly to Tasmania. So now I've mentioned us, people. Let's look at where we were on the global stage. It's generally agreed that our species arose in Africa, South or East Africa, some debate, about 120,000 years ago. And our species was coexisting with other species, the one we call Neanderthals, a species that is known only from a few bits and pieces, but is increasingly attracting attention, called Denisovian man, and a species we know as Homo erectus. And we've always, up until the last decade or so, almost looked down our noses at these other species in our genus as if they were much lesser creatures than ourselves. But more and more, we're beginning to understand that, for example, Neanderthal man was anything but the kind of joke that we now make of him and her. In fact, Neanderthals probably were more culturally advanced than early members of our own species. There was, of course, as in almost inevitable, some interbreeding between these species. And we know that our modern species actually carries within it somewhere within 2 to 3% of our genome, our genes from Denisovian man and Neanderthals. So while we're our own species, we actually also have some genes from these other species. And one of the great things about our genome is it contained a gene which actually satisfied wanderlust. And wanderlust is basically in our genes, and wanderlust is actually a risk-taking behavior. And so we are a species that engages in risk-taking behavior, the most popular of which in the early years was just to go walkabout. And that's exactly what our species did. So Aboriginal people arrived on foot, or perhaps in some cases in very rudimentary canoes or boats, about 60,000 years ago. There's some discussion about that date. There always has been, there always will be. But let's stick, for the purposes of this talk, to 60,000 years. Because during that time, Aboriginal people walked the continent, including walking across the Bassian Plains to Tasmania. And so during that period, where there was still an extraordinary range of climates, because the first Tasmanians almost certainly will have entered a period of Tasmanian climate, which was largely tundra-like. During that period, there was an enormous appreciation among the Aboriginal people of land, the ways the land changed, the way they could live on the land, the way they could live on the shores, and the development of a complex culture. So I mentioned at the start that we're now in the Anthropocene, but there's a lot of discussion about where in the Anthropocene we actually are and where the Anthropocene starts. Some scientists like to say it starts around the time of the end of the Second World War, the arrival of the nuclear explosions. And there are good reasons for that, but they're actually probably more political reasons than scientific reasons. And I think we have to see the Anthropocene as going back much further, perhaps even 100,000 years ago. But it doesn't matter, because the Anthropocene is where we, as the only species now left in our genus, are actually responsible for the planet. And so the Anthropocene's characteristics, some extent external, but ever more influenced by our own behaviors, is dramatic changes in climate, changes in hydrology, especially groundwater, changes in genes, species, and ecosystems, loss of many species, but also movement of species around the planet in ways that without us moving it would not be occurring. And the development of human culture. And human culture is as important as all of these other things. And biodiversity, biological diversity, and cultural diversity among people together form what's known as biocultural diversity. But separation of nature from culture has been identified as a serious problem and given a name, cultural severance, the severance of culture from nature. And the consequences of cultural severance include dramatic declines in ecosystem and species richness and a reduction in landscape quality. And I'd like to talk a little bit now about a great book written by Bill Gammage called The Biggest Estate on Earth. Many of you may have seen it. Many of you, I hope, will even read it. If you haven't, then do read it. And here's a quote from it. Although comprising many ways of maintaining land and managers mostly unknown to each other, this vast area was governed by a single religious philosophy called in English, the dreaming. The dreaming and its practices made the continent a single estate. Bill Gammage is a historian, and ecologists don't necessarily like that idea, that view. But I'm a sort of ecologist, and I do, because I think that that really reflects where we're going wrong and what we need to do to change. Because here's a picture from 1820 painted by Joseph Lycett showing Aboriginal people hunting, and you can see the fire. But you can also see a landscape that's patchy, there's grass and there's forest. So the Aboriginal people had set fire in a managed way to allow the kangaroos to escape so that they could then hunt them. Bill Gammage talks about 1788 as a key date. And he makes the point that plant patterns, vegetation across Australia were all unnatural at that stage. Australia was a managed estate. People had been there for 60,000 years, and they had made similar templates, whether they were in the drier parts, the wetter parts, western, eastern, etc. And although different lives were lived, they were all following the same basic law. And in most parts of Australia, that law is allied with fire, cultural fire. And fire was used to make biodiversity abundant, convenient, Bill's words, and predictable. And what we've now done, since as a collection of non-Aboriginal Australians, we have turned that landscape upside down. We've made it less abundant, inconvenient, and highly unpredictable. And to make the point here, in 2019 to 2020, those bushfires, which we've never seen before, have been strongly linked to climate change. And of course, that's part of the story. You can't say it isn't. However, they've also occurred because of an inability by non-Aboriginal Australians to understand or talk with or to or about biocultural values involved in proper management by Aboriginal people of landscape. And this picture here, which was on the introductory slide, is an Aboriginal fire set in Kakadu National Park. It's not the same as that huge fire you also saw in the introductory slide. So what cultural changes do we need to live in the Anthropocene? We've always had stewardship of changing landscapes, but climate change and the loss of biodiversity make it an order of magnitude different. And as mostly an urban population, we use language terms like wilderness, pristine, wildlands to give impressions that much of Australia is uninhabited, uninhabitable almost. But we need a new discourse. Some time ago, when I was involved in the management of Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory, the chairman, the Aboriginal chairman of the Kakadu Board of Management, said on one occasion when we were discussing wilderness, I don't understand what you guys are talking about when you say wilderness. To me, wilderness is the Sydney CBD. And I think that says it all. We need a different kind of discussion. So a solution is a landscape stewardship approach, I think, which it seeks to improve heritage, food production, biodiversity conservation, rural livelihoods, but acknowledge the interconnections between social justice and environmental health. Stewardship is self-organized, it's highly participatory, supporting adaptive management. The Australian land care movement is a really good example of stewardship, but it's done in a different way. We're beginning to approach through something like the land care movement, Aboriginal interactions. And stewardship values a diversity of ways of knowing, including local and indigenous knowledge about landscapes and natural resources. And so hopefully this effort by the RSA will help to catalyze much more community discussion. It should help in reconciliation efforts. There's the National Land Care Network logo, which has got the black and the white hand. That's an important element, an important symbol of reconciliation. And really, we have to give politicians at all levels food for thought. They need to engage more. Conservation is not just about declaring a new national park. It's about caring for our land in ways that we need to relearn and educate ourselves and learn from the original people who inhabited this vast, fascinating, and wonderful continent. Palya, thank you.